It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen America and Israel accusing Iran of breaking its nuclear deal, Cambridge Analytica closing down over Facebook data breaches, and parts of England going to the polls for local elections. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me this week from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Arion McNicoll, and returning from the week junior, our caped crusader, Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that every revolution has an equal and opposite counter-revolution.
The Ortega family, much like the Somoza family, which governed Nicaragua for 40 years during the 20th century, what they've promised to society has been stability, and in particular to the business elite, economic policies which have been favorable to their interests. In exchange, they have demanded that their political power not be questioned in any way. But as the violent end of the Somoza dictatorship showed, and you see many people tweeting alluding to the Somoza dictatorship, the problem with this model is that it might produce short-term stability, but it comes at the price of human and civil rights. And therefore, when you close off all political avenues for change, for holding your leaders accountable, then the only option, as it was in 1978-79, is to hit the streets.
Nicaraguan historian Mateo Harkin speaking to Al Jazeera this week. And Arion, this is the great thing about this show. You never know where we're going. Nicaragua, there's been tension brewing for a while there. So why now? Why is this your unreported story of the week?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, the president, Daniel Ortega, introduced a rise in social security payments that immediately elicited peaceful protests, but massive protests that saw hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets.
Why would you protest a rise in social security?
It was the social security payments. Basically, the law change meant that workers had to pay more and they'd receive less over time. And also there was another provision in it that meant that pensioners had to pay 5% of their pension towards their healthcare. So everyone was losing out a little bit.
Less popular, yeah.
Yeah. So people took to the street, and it was the government crackdown that really then inflamed protests even further, because police responded with enormous violence and actually shot dead somewhere between, the numbers are a bit disputed, but between 30 and 70 people, which in turn has triggered the protests to continue moving. And they've sort of spread really away from that social security issue that prompted them and became a protest about the Ortega regime itself.
So, Felicity, is this a surprise that you've got a country there where an environment might exist where between 30 and 70 people might be shot dead for protesting?
I think the level of violence is pretty shocking, and I think there was even a journalist who was reporting live on Facebook Live and was shot dead as he was reporting. And obviously that level of violence is going to reverberate. But I think this has been a long time coming. It sounds like it is brewing. There was a great article on Foreign Policy where they likened it to a real-life house of cards. Daniel Ortega, his wife is the VP, so Rosario Murillo. The way they've sort of been governing the country together, I suppose, seems very despotic. They control the courts. They've banned independent election observers. There's indefinite re-election. All these sort of things. You can see why frustration has been brewing for a while. And then these very sort of symbolic giant metal trees called the Árboles de la Vida, which Murillo, she wanted to erect about 140 massive metal trees that would make the capital city look incredibly sanitized and arty and lovely. And I think during these demonstrations, they've just sort of been ripped down and set on fire as a sort of symbol of absolute disgust at the way the country is turning out.
I heard a commentator saying that it was Murillo's Marie Antoinette moment, that she'd erected these things while, the country was experiencing hardship in other ways. And she'd put up these trees that each cost $25,000 and take millions of dollars to maintain every year.
Project, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely staggering.
Okay, so appointing her as VP, maybe that was the moment where it became more obvious that the government could be criticised and corrupt and whatever. But Ortega's been around for a while, and he was there as the product of a revolution himself, right? So what's the public feeling towards him, do you think?
Exactly. The long-term view of Ortega is that he's turned from being a Mandela figure into being something of a Mugabe-type figure. He was around in the 70s and was part of the Sandinista movement that brought down the long-term Somoza regime, which was a very authoritarian regime that was in power for about 40 years, and then became one of the country's first post-Somoza presidents, but then lost power between the mid-80s until the early 2000s. And once he was re-elected at that stage, it was then that he started to kind of consolidate his power and make these moves, like appointing his wife to being his vice president. And in 2014, he abolished the term limit for how many terms presidents could have, because historically they could only have two, and he is now on his third. And so I think that there is that feeling that he's creeping into a sort of modern-day dictatorial mode, or at least amongst the people who have been out protesting.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I was going to say, it was in the 1970s and the 1980s, he was really looked upon as a kind of a model socialist president, put through a lot of, like land reforms, redistribution of wealth, and was, looked upon as someone that Western progressives could look to as an example of a successful socialist regime. And then since returning to power in the 2000s, he's taken a very conservative stance. I think maybe we've talked about it before. There's been kind of a conservative wave in Central and South America, and Ortega's kind of been one at the forefront of that. Very anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, very close to the church, and using the church as a way to kind of prop up his regime even further. And so a lot of young people, because this recent protest movement has been led by students, young people are now using his own revolutionary slogans from the 70s in their protests against him as a symbol of how hypocritical they think the regime has become. His government has been propped up on three things, which is the church, business leaders and the security forces, and he's kind of lost two of them. The church has come out against the recent crackdowns. They organised a massive protest on Saturday, and they say that they're going to give the Ortega government a month to try and pull themselves together before they withdraw from negotiations with them. And the business leaders very, very much fallen out with the government now as well, because the social security reforms also increased contributions of employers as well as employees, so he really just alienated everyone. Ortega's future is really going to rest on whether he can retain control over the police and armed forces.
And there was a symbolism as well in the protesters who were arrested and then apparently beaten in prison, that they were being held in the same cells that Ortega and the Sandinistas were being held in during their revolution. So one of the chants that the protesters were saying was Ortega, Somoza son la misma cosa, which is that Ortega and Somoza, they're the same thing. So there is this real sort of feeling that what we're seeing is the same kind of creeping autocracy that we had the first time round. So it really is it's a critical moment.
Which is really interesting that he's become the bad guy, and he was sort of seen as this. It made me think of Hungary and Viktor Orbán, which is the same kind of thing. You had, in 1989, he appeared on the scene and gave this incredible speech calling for free elections, calling for the withdrawal of communist forces, and was definitely seen as a democratic force for good. And look at him now. I mean, he's in one of the most autocratic countries in Europe. He's talked about an illiberal democracy. I mean, why do they do it? Is this sort of thirst and this insatiable quench for power that everything else sort of goes out the window? I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, and also times have changed in terms of the public reaction, partly through technology, partly through globalization as well, hasn't it? So this crackdown, heavy-handed police crackdown on protesters, the results of that now, if you think about the Arab Spring, I mean, this is analogous to what happened in Tunisia in a way, isn't it? You could imagine something like that happening. Do you think it could spread to other parts of Central and South America?
It could do. I mean, you've already got mass protests in Venezuela, in any case, where they've got not an unparalleled situation of pink tide leadership that has outstayed its welcome, and that country is riven with all sorts of challenges. But yeah, you've got this active protest movement that are being cracked down on as harshly. People are being shot dead there as well. As for whether it leads to some broad thing, I think because each of the Latin American countries have such internally complicated situations, I don't think you're going to see a broad movement necessarily, but there are definitely parallels in the region.
Okay, time for something completely different. Rebecca, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week we all started saying Kerno Bisviken?
That was, of course, Is Kiss, the second single from Gweno's 2018 record Likov, available to stream now. Rebecca, it's a nice song. It's quite Europoppy. Where's it from?
Well, she's a Welsh singer-songwriter, but she's recorded this whole album in Cornish. She also speaks Cornish. Her father was a Cornish-language poet. So this is her single that was released earlier this year. I think it was released last month. But this week she wrote an article for The Big Issue entirely in Cornish with no English translation. To find out what the English was, you had to go on the website and read the translation. So it's thought to be the first ever Cornish magazine article. Quite a hard thing to quantify, but to all intents and purposes, that seems to be the consensus. And it just kind of got me thinking about the Cornish language revival and how it compares to other language revivals, and whether it's got, it sounds harsh to say, but whether it's got a strong future.
And what was her article about? Because that song we just heard, the lyrics are all about cheese.
Yeah, it was based on a Cornish nursery rhyme, I think. Her article was not about cheese.
Okay. The lyrics are, is there cheese? Is there or isn't there? If there's cheese, bring cheese. And if there isn't cheese, bring what's easy.
That's a sentiment we can all get behind.
What was the article about?
So the article was all about the Cornish language and the reason that she decided to record an album in Cornish, etc., etc. But of course, she's kind of emblematic of the state of the Cornish language in that she is not from Cornwall and does not live in Cornwall. A lot of the people who...
Sorry, what? Yeah, I know you said she was Welsh. She's not Cornish and she doesn't live in... Why has she written a thing in Cornish
then?
Just
Exactly. The highest concentration of Cornish speakers is actually in London. Not many people speak.
Right, well, that's your answer then, isn't
Cornish
it?
And Cornwall.
I mean, if we're going to have a debate about why is the Cornish language down, that's the fact right there, surely.
About 500 people in Cornwall speak Cornish fluently as a native language. Obviously, they're all also bilingual in English. And another 500, possibly more, are learning it as a second language. So it's a very small-scale language revival compared to other also Celtic languages like Welsh, which has about 500,000 speakers, and Breton in France, which has about 200,000.
Cornish cheese is delicious, though.
Oh, good to know. Cornish blue, actually, yeah.
Cornish yarg.
Yeah, I love yarg.
Yeah, love the yarg. Love the kern. I think that won an award as like Europe's best cheese. I might be making that up, but anyway, the reason I was just maybe it is important though, because I do think it's something
Your
to do with.
Your thoughts on Cornish cheese aren't important.
They are very important. I think that's why people are listening right now. But the reason I was talking about Cornish cheese is because I do think the story is to do with Cornwall's identity more broadly, and I feel like Cornwall certainly was, I think it probably still is, the second poorest region in Northern Europe, and I feel that they get this influx of tourism every single summer. All these people sort of descend and go to the beach and go to the ice cream, and there's this something about the Cornish people that there's a lot of poverty there, and they kind of want this resurgence of their national identity. And Cornwall has a really, long, interesting history and identity, and I wonder whether this is a sort of another way that they're trying to express that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that Gweno has said in other interviews is that she doesn't, a lot of people, I think when you think Cornish language speakers, you think, kind of men with beards sipping ale and refusing to speak English.
How did you get into my head?
But she makes the point that actually for her, as I think you can kind of glean from her interviews, that she sees herself as a progressive, open-minded person. She sees it as a reminder in the Brexit period of how fluid British identity is, and how there is no single Anglo-Saxon British identity, and we should all be more mindful of our regional influences.
But then ironically, Cornwall voted for Brexit, and actually it's the European Union that has given them the most funding and gave them, it was a European classification that made Cornwall a distinct region as rather just being part of the sort of wealthy south.
But there's not necessarily a contradiction there, is there? Because if you're very independent spirited and you'd vote for an independent Cornwall, you can see why the rhetoric of Brexit might have appealed to them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I just think it's an irony that, if they want to preserve their language, they need funding, and, Westminster's cut that funding, didn't it, in not too long ago, and that they would have probably got more from Europe.
Well, that's it, isn't it, Arion? Like, not just funding, but actually infrastructure. I mean, Rebecca talked about the size of the Welsh-speaking world, and of course it is bigger than the Cornish-speaking world. But one of the reasons Welsh is so prevalent in Wales is they actually have legislation that says they'll offer jobs to people who can speak Welsh over people who are qualified to do the job, and then they'll train you in the job. So they've ingrained bilingualism. You can't really do that in Cornwall, it's too small.
No, I agree, and I think that actually for those languages that are on the critically endangered list that UNESCO has, there's 7,000 languages in the world, give or take. and around the estimate from UNESCO is that about half of them are going to be gone by the turn of the century. But the critically endangered ones, and Cornish falls into that category, you do need a great amount of intervention to keep them alive. And you've seen success stories with something like modern Hebrew. Maori has been really successfully kept alive in New Zealand, and there are steps being taken in Australia to try to save and preserve some of the Aboriginal languages. But it's really, really complicated, and I think you're right. If you don't have a critical mass to start off with, let alone governmental support, you're going to be in trouble.
And so one of the major challenges that Cornish has as well, compared to some of those other language revivals you mentioned, is the fact that Hebrew wasn't used widely conversationally, but had always been in use as a religious language.
It's in some important books.
Yes,
it's difficult
believe
to think
so.
of rival books in Cornish, isn't it, to the
Yes,
Old Testament?
and in Brittany and Wales, there's never been an absence of native speakers of those languages, even though the numbers have dwindled. Even on the Isle of Man, the last native Manx speaker died in 1974, so well within living memory. The last native Cornish speaker, as in a monolingual Cornish speaker, is thought to have died in the 1700s. So you are really looking at language that was extinct to all intents and purposes as a first language. In fact, UNESCO actually classified it as extinct in 2009, and then there was a massive backlash, and they ended up reclassifying it as critically endangered 1 year later.
Nearly extinct apart from cheese songs.
Yeah, apart
It's
from
a
the
special
cheese songs.
category.
I mean, there are still Cornish phrases and the Cornish dialect, which has obviously been imitated.
What can we
horribly a
get
lot.
from Cornish that we can't get from English?
I mean, that's a question that you could ask of any regional language.
Man, I'm asking about Cornish.
But there'd be very old poems and stories and that sort of thing. But I mean, does a language have to be practical for it to justify, keeping it alive?
No, I'm asking what artistic value is there in Cornish? Educate me. I'm asking genuinely.
Did you know that they have 50 words for cheese?
There we go. That's an example.
There's artistic merit in every language, isn't there? Wouldn't you say that every language does contain something of the spirit or the culture behind it?
Yeah. Listen to this. Cherokee, for example, has no word for goodbye, only I will see you again. Isn't that a really nice way of thinking about
That's lovely.
goodbye? And also, one word, ukahusti, and I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, who knows, represents how you feel when you see an adorable baby or a kitten, which I guess in English is, aww. But they have...
But again, that's in Cherokee.
Yeah.
Not in Cornish.
Well, no, but it's part of the same argument.
Okay, Felicity, you're last this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Welcome to the Crazy Club.
I've never condoned that at all, but I'm there to
Why
listen...
didn't you bring it up as a Christian?
Could I answer? Thank you. We're there to listen to the people, and the people's concern, understandably at that time, was the missile attack by the US, UK and France. They say it was illegal, there was no mandate, Syria is not a threat to our countries. It was timely, very unethical, because it preempted the visit by the chemical weapons inspectors. It was also potentially very dangerous.
What Amnesty say is that people are taken in large numbers, they're severely beaten over the course of 2 to 3 hours. In the middle of the night, they're blindfolded and transferred in delivery trucks or minibuses to a vehicle. They're taken to a room and they're hanged. It takes place once or twice a week, 20 or 50 people hanged to death. And they say those death sentences are approved by the Grand Mufti of Syria. I'm just amazed, as a Christian, you didn't mention that to him.
Well, thank you. Actually, I wasn't aware of that at the time we visited him.
Baroness Cox speaking to Justin Webb on the BBC's Today programme at the end of April. Felicity, this was about the supposed fact-finding trip to Syria last month. Delegates included Lady Cox and also the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Giles Fraser. What's happened this week?
Well, this week I think it's been bubbling away for a while, but this week it was interesting because more details have sort of come out about the delegation, and it now appears as though there were, along with Baroness Cox and Giles Fraser and other members of the clergy, there were also journalists and academics. And there's been sort of more details emerging about some of their consternation and their unhappiness about just the sheer sort of blatant propaganda they are exposed to.
Examples?
The people they had to speak to, I think they were shown a video about, I mean, everything was just about how wonderful Assad is and how he's protecting Christians in Syria. And there was very little, if any, exposure to how Syrian Muslims there are being treated.
And the video supposedly said that the chemical attack video that we'd seen was the result of terrorists blowing up weapons that had been left there by the Americans or something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly.
But the only way to get into Syria, if you're a Christian missionary and you want to try and do something good, is to accept the invitation of Assad, isn't it? So that doesn't mean that the people on the bus had disabled their independent critical faculty, and they are going to have to endure stuff like that to get there.
Well, I think that's what they're arguing this week. I think one of the journalists, Gareth Brown, who writes for The National, he was very unhappy about what he was subjected to when he was there. But even that, I feel, even as journalists, let alone members of the clergy, I think you're on sort of shaky ground. This is a state-controlled trip. I mean, how much did they really think as journalists they were going to be able to see the real picture of what's going on in Syria? So I think it's extraordinary. And I also think you have to think about it from the point of view of ordinary Syrians. I mean, there was a headline in a Syrian newspaper which read "British delegation visits Syria." So for them, this almost looks like it's sort of supported or sanctioned by Britain as a nation, and I think Baroness Cox was sort of dressing it up as a pastoral trip, but it wasn't. It was political, and that's really, really shocking. And this isn't the first time this has happened. I think the story has only kind of leaked out because Giles Fraser sent some very unfortunate tweets about how he was sitting down and having tea with, and it was also lovely in Damascus, and this is what's caused an uproar. But actually, these trips have been going on since the civil war erupted, and I think it's absolutely staggering that this has just flown completely under the radar.
But Rebecca, maybe the Grand Mufti isn't someone you want to sit down and have a nice cup of tea with.
Sure, I agree.
But if you are a real serious Christian and it's all about forgiveness and empathy and having an open discussion, then you have a cup of tea with everybody, don't you? There's nothing, inherently wrong with tweeting that.
If you're not aware of their atrocities at the time, I think anything goes.
Even if you are, you could still legitimately come at it from the point of view of, we're going to have an open discussion with, people who are perceived as the enemy. We're going to have an open discussion with people who are doing terrible things because I'm a Christian. Yeah,
well, I think that, there's quite a strong and yet under the radar lobby of these coalitions of Christians looking out for one another, supposedly, especially in the Middle East, where, we have seen atrocities committed against Christians and other religious minorities, not just in Syria, but, obviously in Egypt, the attacks on the Copts and everything. But I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. That's not really a narrative that we hear that much about in the mainstream. But behind the scenes, there are a lot of people in influential positions who are so concerned about the positions of these minorities that, like Felicity was saying, they kind of overlook what's happening to the Muslim majority and, the atrocities being committed against them in Syria by the Assad regime, because they see Assad as the person who's protecting, because he himself is from a minority in Syria, they see him as the person who can protect those groups from what they see as the Islamist-dominated rebel groups. And I think that is, I don't know, without sympathising too much with Baroness Cox, because I do think she was obviously very misguided in what she said, there is some truth to that narrative that I think sometimes in the West, especially progressives, do tend to overlook the fact that the situation with the rebels is so complex and we don't know a huge amount always about the complex alliances and allegiances.
I think that's right. And I think as well, if we've learnt anything from the most recent couple of military interventions in Syria by most recently America, France and Britain together, but prior to that there was, a year ago America acted alone, is that those military strikes are not necessarily achieving anything, actually. They're not strategic, they don't have an end goal, and if you want to be sympathetic to any aspect of what Baroness Cox was doing, and I think that there's lots of flaws in what she was doing, at least opening dialogue, I think everyone has started to agree, is the only way that this horrific civil war is going to have an end. There needs to be conversation. It probably doesn't need to be an unsanctioned Christian group talking to people who are political propagandists, but there do need to be talks. So if you were to take one positive, it would be the opening of some kind of dialogue. But
well, except she didn't seem to want to open a dialogue in this country, did she? I mean, that was the thing. You heard Justin Webb on the Today programme there, condemning her fairly harshly, but actually just saying, here is some criticism of what you've done, and she just clearly didn't want to have that conversation.
I think she's also written a complaint to the BBC about how that interview was handled, and that the fact that she claims she didn't know that the Amnesty claims is the one who signs off on all these terrible murders. But she sent in a complaint about how that whole interview was handled. So she is clearly not one who likes to have her views
challenged.
And also, apparently, according to this journalist who was out there on the trip, when he questioned her, she invoked her parliamentary privilege, her right as a peer sitting at the House of Lords, to say that she didn't have to answer that question. So I'm a little bit dubious as to whether a real dialogue was opened up.
This isn't a turning point, though, is it? I mean, Syria's been going on for years now. None of this. I mean, we can all talk about these little events as if they have great significance, but they don't. This is a massive civil war that's going to last for decades, and essentially there's nothing that the West doing anything about it.
I think that's absolutely right. I think, unfortunately, I think, unfortunately, we're in it for the long haul. And partly it's because there is no consistency of this narrow alliance trying to find a positive way out of what is becoming an increasingly intractable situation that's involving so many parties, including Turkey and the Kurds in the north, and then Israel with its own resistance to the Hezbollah, who are supported by Iran. And you've got just an incredibly complicated situation that, I can't see this being a turning point, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I mean, it's complicated enough without Baroness Cox needing to wade in. So let's
Agreed.
Just keep it to its current complication.
Okay, I'll cancel her invite onto next week's episode then. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity, Capon, Arion, McNicoll and Rebecca Gillie. If you enjoy the show, then please take a moment to rate and review and subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. It really helps. Thank you to everyone who's done that in the last few weeks. And for more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday. Or, of course, you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.